There we go. Yes, record. Oh, it's told me
You've got
recording
it.
in progress. There we go. Okay. So I'm going to ask Sarah, did you want to introduce anything or give any kind of an opening? Okay. I just wanted to thank Sarah for putting this together. She's been putting together classes for officers. She initially aimed at Alicia because it's hard to get, Alicians down to collegia, and it's hard to get people up to Alicia to teach classes and so on. So she felt that this might be a good way to help out, and then she just started opening it up, which is cool. So like we got Cal from Meridies over here and so on. One thing to note, this is going to be, just by its very nature, West Kingdom centric. So when I start, I'm going to look at the ceremony books, that kind of thing. So just to give you, there's going to be a few things that'll be fairly West Kingdom centric, and there'll be some more generic. A lot of it, basic court stuff is kind of generic. So now I do have a PowerPoint presentation, so I'm going to do the share screen, go to PowerPoint, and share, and then I'm going to start it. I'm going to be back and forth on this. I'm not going to be, just be hidden behind everything. I am asking that you mute your microphone in general. If you have a question, speak up, because I may not even notice if you do the hand raising thing. So real quick, who I am. Those of you who know me, you're pretty familiar with what I do, but for those of you who don't, I've been in the SCA since the late 70s, and during that time, almost all of that time, I have been a herald in some capacity. I got involved playing with armory, and then I found other stuff, and I got involved in doing voice because I got a degree in theater, and all of that kind of sucked in. I started out in Alaska. I was the second Stella Nordica herald. Okay. That's cool. Okay. And I was also the Seawolf Herald when I moved to the Mists at some point. I've held several of the Kingdom offices, including Vesper, and back when it was Banner Herald as opposed to Green Crown now. The title changed. But I've done a lot of court heraldry over the years. I've got a lot of experience with it, although I haven't done it much in the last while since I stepped down from Vesper, because I stepped back from a bunch of stuff. So, but I've also taught classes on it and so on. So we'll start off by going to the next slide. So what are we going to cover? We're going to talk about a wide range of things. We're going to start off with the real basics. What is court? We're going to talk about what you do before court, during court. We're going to take a look at the ceremony book for the West. I'm just going to briefly look at it. I'm not going to go into huge detail, but just to give you some things. We're talking about after court, which includes court reports, and I'm going to actually do a simple court report so that you can see it being done. Okay, and I'll even submit it and show you what the results look like. And we'll have some miscellaneous stuff, including you're in a far out place like Alicia or wherever, and the royalty decide to visit, and they didn't bring a ceremony book. It happens. Okay, so what do you do? So we'll talk about all of that. So, and we might even get in a couple of horror stories depending on what how things go. Places where I've screwed up or whatever. Okay, so what is court? So court is where official business of the kingdom, principality, and/or barony is conducted. And by official business, I do want to note that obviously there are some things that don't get done in court. But all of the stuff with awards, all of the stuff with law changes, in the West, law changes have to be put into the law, but they're not official until they've been read in court. And that's been part of the laws of the West since very, very early on. Okay, so there's a lot of stuff like that. But another side of this that is often not discussed is that the populace is the audience, but they're there as witness to the official business. Okay, and that's an important aspect of why we do all this stuff out in the open like that, is so that the populace are witnessing all of this official stuff that's going on. Okay, so now that's just the real basics of what is court, and we're going to talk about different types of courts. So what kinds of courts are there? In the West, there are several, okay? We have the standard court. And what I mean by that is you come to court, there's usually some awards, there's some announcements, the autocrat or event steward now steps up and talks about things and all of that. We have an invocation court, and for especially kingdom attorneys, but even principality attorneys, the invocation court is usually done as a separate court, which allows people who don't want to sit through invocation to go off and get food or do whatever they want to do. But invocation is the invocation of the list where the fighters introduce themselves, they introduce their consorts and all of that good stuff. Coronation and investiture. These are the big ones, obviously, and they're the most flashy for the most part. They're the law change courts. So I mentioned earlier, the law changes have to be read in court. If we have a lot of law changes that happen, sometimes during a reign, somebody decides that they need to make a bunch of changes for whatever reason. Okay, sometimes there's really good reasons for it. Sometimes you wonder, but that's what happens. The law changes, as I mentioned, have to be read in court. So sometimes there will be a separate law change court, because having somebody stand up in court and just read law changes is not the most exciting thing to listen to. But there are people that actually do attend law change courts because they're interested. They want to know what's going on. Okay, but this way it kind of frees up the rest of the populace who don't want to be feeling like they're trapped in court. If there's a single law change, that will often just be slipped into a regular court, no big deal. There's presentation, and we don't see too many of what I call presentation courts anymore. But for a while, a lot of people decided that they wanted to give presentations to the royalties, stuff that they had made or stuff that they had found or whatever. And they did it in court. And the problem is courts get really long. And if you have a bunch of presentations in the middle of court that are just, we're doing this thing, and I did this, I want to do this thing with, give the king this thing that I made, and then they talk about this thing for 5 minutes. The populace doesn't know what's going on. It gets a little boring. They're not directly involved in this presentation. The king gets some really cool thing, and then we move on. Well, that slows everything down. And when you're trying to deal with the flow of court, that can be a problem. We'll talk about some of that again in a bit. So we used to have occasionally a presentation court. We would state, if you have presentations, the king and queen will be sitting in state later, and we will do a court just for that purpose. And you can come up and give them these cool things that you've made, or this cool bottle of wine that you found, or whatever it happens to be. And then you can chat with them, and they can look it over and ooh and ah and pat you on the head and all that. So now, traveling courts are something that's actually kind of mostly relatively new, although they have happened in the past. But a traveling court is where the royalty decides, for whatever reason, and there can be a lot of different reasons, to take court to somebody's camp. It can be because they want to, ask somebody if they will accept membership in an order of peerage. Boy, I'm doing good tonight. And so on. But there can be other things. We had at one point a woman who was a Mongol, and she had her own camp out, and she camped far away from the main part of kingdom, and the crown wanted to give her an award of arms. She did not feel like, as her own camp and as the person in charge of that camp, that the king could not command her to come into court, so the king went to her and brought court with him, and she got her award of arms in her own camp. So it was still an official court, but we all traveled off to her camp to do it. So it's kind of an awkward but kind of fun little excursion to go out to the Mongol camp. So now, what kinds of business can there be? Okay, now the big one, and as I mentioned, the flashiest one is the coronation or investiture. If you're dealing with baronial, it's obviously the baronial changeover, which can be also called an investiture, and so on. That's usually pretty flashy. Depends on who it is that's coming in and who's going out and so on. Some people put on a really big show just on their own and all of that. Awards, pretty obvious. A lot of awards awards must be given in court, so there's that. Other ceremonies, which can include change of office or bringing up people for fealty. This becomes really important, especially in the case of relatively recently, when, you know, we've had smaller events, and so the king and queen go to other places, and they go to an event, and they call up people that might not have made it to their coronation, and so they can then do the fealty there. Creation of a barony doesn't happen very often anymore, but it is something that's, you know, there is actually a full ceremony in the ceremony book for it, and so on. So presentations, as mentioned, announcements. Of course, we always get the announcements in court. One of the hardest parts is sometimes, especially if you're new, is you want to type. Part of your brain says put all the presentations in one place. That can get really boring. So or put all the announcements in one place. We'll talk about splitting things up and all that. War challenges. These happen in court. They can be fun. Sometimes they're not quite as exciting as others, but sometimes they can be really hysterical. A lot of shtick that can go with these. My favorite was when Leon von Schrecken was Prince of the Mist, and Garth of Windhaven was Prince of Sinagua, and Leon went off, challenge, 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 Mist will stomp all over you, and so on. And Garth stood up and said, oh yeah, and that was the whole thing. So they can be really interesting. There can be other stuff and so on. So yeah, there are a lot of things that can be talked about here, but we're going to go into general preparation. So one of the first things that you need to do is to get some vocal training in. Okay, if you've never done court, vocal training is really important. And the biggest thing with vocal training is projection from the abdomen, and that is a learned skill. I mean, there are people that obviously don't really need to learn it. Some people have got those mom voices that carry all the way across camp, but most people don't. And so you need to learn to project. There's a whole set of class notes from a class taught in Owertha that are up on the Herald site, and we'll talk about the Herald site briefly. That was done, I think, last summer. They held a heraldic collegium up in Owertha. And there's a set of class notes just on vocal training. Okay, so you'll want to look for that if you need to. You should always try to be familiar with the ceremonies, and we'll come back to this because sometimes ceremonies change. Sometimes the changes are minor, sometimes they can be fairly large. And so if you've done a ceremony once, doesn't mean it's the same ceremony the next time you do it. And so you might want to make sure you review the ceremony. So we'll come back. And this is one of my favorite bits. This comes from an article that Maxim Fidelis wrote years and years ago on being a court herald, and it's read a book. So Maxim Fidelis talked about read a book, try a book of poetry, especially one from period or shortly thereafter, and read it out loud. Just reading it to yourself isn't the same as reading it out loud, because reading it out loud, you will find that there is a pattern and a flow to the poetry. Okay, which you don't necessarily get if you're just reading it in your head. Okay, steal shamelessly, and I love this bit. Not the material, but the style. If there's a herald who does things that you like, try to do things in their style. You can pick up some really good technique by just watching other court heralds. Okay, and then he comes back to read a book. Try a book of plays. Try Shakespeare. Read it out loud. Shakespeare makes a lot more sense if you read it out loud. Trust me. I've got a degree in theater, and it didn't make sense until the first play I was in, where I actually had to do it out loud. Okay. Go to church, go to a synagogue, a mosque, whether you're a believer or not. Look at the ceremony. The ceremony is what we're doing, and that's an important aspect of the whole thing. Ceremonies have different parts to them. So the herald does their part, the crown does their part, the person receiving an award sometimes has lines, and so on. So read a book, read this stuff, and go and just learn from these different ways of doing things. Okay. So I'm going to talk now about before court, and I'm going to turn off the share just because it's kind of nice to be able to see the instructor once in a while. Not that I'm proud of my face or anything, but so court itself, there are things that you need to do before court. So they include a lot of things. So one of them is to arrange for your backup or your consort side herald. If you're doing a small court, if you're doing like a baronial court or even some of the principality courts where there's not a lot of business, you can get away with not having a second herald. But for anything that's bigger, having a consort side herald is really helpful because they can have a copy of the ceremonies on that side of the thrones. And even if they don't do any of the herald's lines, and sometimes they will, depending on how you work things out with your heralds, but they will have the ceremony right there so that the princess or the queen doesn't have to look over the king to look at the ceremony book on the other side of court. Having a backup herald can be very useful, somebody that you can turn to and state, here, hold the ceremony book for a moment while I do these announcements, things like that. And so it's kind of nice to be able to do that. And your backup herald can also make sure that you drink water, just as a side note. Make sure that an announcement goes out that court business is being taken, but don't just state, we're taking business for court. You need to tell them who's taking the business and where it's being taken. Now, usually that will be at a kingdom event at Herald's Point. But, you may have someplace else. You may be taking business for court in the Royal Pavilion. But as long as you tell people where to find you, or if it's somebody else who's taking the business, make sure that they know who that person is. It's an easy thing to forget to mention these things. So, okay. Now, when you're taking court business, make sure that the person you are taking it from knows that unless it's official business, it may not make it. And this is where the presentation thing comes in. Presentations can be interesting because you don't want to be surprising the royalty. And we'll come back to that as well. So presentations are the big one. Announcements. Now, with announcements, an important aspect is, and you've probably seen courts like this, somebody comes up, makes an announcement, and they ramble. They're not real together. They're talking about something, and it takes a long time for them to get said what you as the herald might get out in 2 or 3 sentences. And they end up going on for a bit, and then court drags and court drags and court drags. And some people just don't have voices that carry very well, or they're not comfortable standing up in public. And so what you can do is ask them if they want to do the announcement or if they should have you do it. Okay? So if you're going to be the one doing it, make sure you write down all the important aspects of what the announcement is. But it can make things flow a lot faster if the herald does some of the announcements rather than having the members of the populace do them all. Remind the person that presentations and announcements should be short and not to ramble. And again, what somebody thinks is not rambling is something else. Now, 45 minutes before court, have a final call just to make sure, because there are people that don't listen, or they're busy, or they're, maybe they got somebody who's fighting and they're paying attention to that, whatever. There's lots of reasons why somebody might not have heard the call earlier for business, but before court, have another call. Send out the duty heralds, or we're calling them the town crier heralds now, but have them send out the town crier herald and so on. And then go back to the royalty. One of the most important aspects of being a court herald is that it's about the royalty. It's not about the herald, okay? They need to be the ones who approve or don't approve all of the business, okay? So we go back to the royalty. They may have come up with some things that they didn't tell you before, okay? That happens all the time. So now, one thing that we're going to talk about when we get to the court report as well, but this isn't obvious. If you're doing a coronation, investiture, baronial changeover, and you're handling the court for the outgoing royalty, get their email addresses. This tripped us up a little while back, and it's nobody's fault. We just had a communication problem. But we resolved it recently, but anyway, but get the email addresses of the outgoing royalty, because sometimes the IT department will change the email forwarding. Well, actually, they will always change it, and they're now changing it 7 days after the coronation. So get those addresses, because if you don't get your court report in before the addresses change, then the royalty won't see the court report, and that can be interesting, okay? So, and again, we'll come back to that. So, organizing. Now, this is where things can be a challenge. Okay. I was talking with somebody before we started about this. This can be interesting. So you've got various things that need blazons. If somebody is getting a peerage or a grant of arms or so on, the ceremony actually has a place for you to read out their blazon as part of the ceremony. Okay, because they are being granted a patent of arms or a grant of arms or even an award of arms if they have their arms registered. Okay, and so it's nice to be able to actually do that. And of course, for royal peerages, it really helps to have their blazon for their arms. Court should build towards a climax. So this gets tricky, and there's a whole bunch of stuff in several articles on organizing court that talk about ways to think about it. I'm going to point you at those later because I'm not going to try to cover every detail in all of these. But the idea is, especially if you know the players, if you know who is in court and who is getting awards and so on, there may be somebody who's getting a court barony, which may not seem like the ultimate climax for a court if there's a peerage in there. But if you know the players and you know how popular that person is, and that person may be really, really super popular, and the fact that they're getting a court barony is just going to cause people to erupt in cheers, where with the peerage, it may be somebody that people don't know as well. You could actually put that court barony as one of the last items of business rather than putting the peerage as the last item of business. You know, that kind of thing. But that one takes some knowledge of who you're working with.
Hirsch,
Yeah.
Demir asked a question in the chat.
Okay, I'm looking at my slideshow, so just a second here.
He asks, "What's a blazon?"
Okay,
and I know he knows what that is.
That's an important point. So the blazon is the heraldic description of somebody's coat of arms. Okay, so if you have a registered coat of arms, the blazon is the language that we use to actually describe it to the heralds and to the scribes, so that it can be reproduced. And it's really important for the scribes to have something that's reproducible, right? Does that make sense? Okay, so and getting that blazon may be a little tricky if you don't know where it is, but I can tell you, if you look in the awards list or the who's who on the history site, the blazons are there. Okay, and I put a lot of effort into making sure that they're there and that they're correct. So when something gets changed by the College of Arms, I go in and I change it on our stuff as well. Okay, so, but that's a good question. I didn't even think about, I just went barreling on, not even thinking about the fact that you might not know that one. Okay, so now the other thing is, when we're talking about organizing the court business, is if you have 15 announcements, scatter the announcements among everything else. Because if you just stand there and start having a bunch of announcements going on, you're going to bore your audience. You're going to bore the populace. You're going to bore the royalty. They're going to start drinking, and drunk royalty can be really interesting, but not always in the best way. Okay. Now, there are other things that you can do to help you with organizing your court. So there are several methods and these again are in different articles and they're talked about, but I'm going to briefly go over them. There's a form that's actually on the Herald's website that is really useful for people who aren't real familiar with doing court. And I've got a link up on the Herald's website in the court section and so on. But it's literally designed just to allow you to lay things out, put a number by each item in the left column, and you can rearrange the court just by changing the numbers. Okay. There's a place on the right to check something off and state I've done this one, which is kind of frustrating to go, oops, I started an announcement I've already done, right? And it happens to everybody, right? So now another one is to write a list in order. Now that's a little tricky because the list that you put in order, the royalty may come along and state, no, let's move this up here, and suddenly you're either going to have to rewrite your list or whatever. So now there are some people who are really comfortable with the idea of just laying out a list. These are the things that have to be done, and then putting numbers and just numbering them as they need to, and then checking them off as they go. Some people work well that way. I'm one of those people. I'm kind of anal. I really like having to lay it out in the order that I want to do it. Okay, and I have had the royalty reorder it, but you can deal with that. And then the last option is to use index cards. And you don't see too many heralds using these because there's one really major problem. What happens if you drop the deck? right? So that's a real problem, right? Suddenly your court is spread out all over camp, right? So there are people that deal with it, but it allows you to shuffle the cards, put them in an order, and then if the crown wants to rearrange things, you can rearrange the cards. But it is a way of handling it. I mention it because it may work for you. I mean, different people work differently. So okay, now this is still part of the organizing, and it's kind of an important point, and you see Heralds trip over this one all the time. Write the current date down. Okay, write down the names of the royalty in a phonetic pronunciation, especially for some royalties. Some of their names can be a little tricky, just like other people's names. If you've done field heraldry, you've dealt with names and so on. But write them down and put them on a Post-it note or someplace that you will see it. Put it at the top of all your stuff so that you have it right there and always available, because it's real easy, especially the year. People will stop in the middle and go, May 24th, what year is it now? And they will just, and suddenly people start yelling out, it's year 57, and so on. But if you lay it out and you have it handy, then it's right there. Let's see here. Always, again, review the court business with the royalty. Okay. Now, again, I emphasize this one a lot, and I'm going to come back and hit on it again. But the idea is we've had heralds who seem to feel like it was about them, not the royalty. Okay, so they're up there rather than being an MC or master of ceremonies, right? Rather than being an MC and making sure court business is happening and making sure the ceremonies happen and do all that, they're up there being the show, and they're making jokes and they're and so on, and that can be funny. But especially for a long court, it means you're slowing down court, you're causing problems, and it's not about the royalty at that point. It's about what's he going to say next, right? And once it becomes what's the herald going to say next, rather than what are the royalty doing, then you've lost the focus of the court. Okay, so it really needs to be about the royalty. Okay, so one of the big things with reviewing the court, especially when you get closer to the actual time of court, is that the royalty, again, somebody will remind them that there was a court recommendation that they hadn't remembered to put on the court report, or they will remember something just out of the top of their head, or they will suddenly go, oh yeah, I want to do this as well. And so you have to then deal with maybe rearranging some of the items in your court. One of the things that I've seen that was actually kind of cool was when somebody is doing an announcement, but they're also listed to get an award. I've had the royalty move the award up because they're already in court. Okay, so suddenly the award that you had listed down your list of ways is moved up to here. But it makes sense because they're right there, right? So you don't have to call them back into court and do all that good stuff. Okay, now find out if the royalty are going to be starting court sitting in state, or what we sometimes call teleporting, meaning that court starts with the royalty right there, or if they're going to be processing it. There's really good reason for that, and we'll get to that, and we'll get to the standard openings for court in just a little bit, but the wording is a little different if the royalty are sitting in state already versus them coming into court and sometimes being announced by somebody, having their own herald come in and just announce them as they come into court, and then each set of royalty might have their own sets of their own heralds to go with them. Okay, so the Miss might have the Seawolf Herald announce the principality, the prince and princess, and so on. So now, and the final preparations. This is kind of important. The final preparations for court include checking for your props. Now that means your tabard or your baldric or whatever you're using to show that you're the herald. Okay, if it's a really hot event, you may not want to wear a full tabard because you're already wearing whatever layers of clothing you're wearing. But having something that says you're the herald is kind of important. Make sure that you have your ceremony books. Make sure if there are scrolls, promissories, award tokens. The royalty often makes sure that the award tokens are there, but you might want to remind them. Again, people get busy, they get scattered, a lot of things happen. The royalty, you'll be in the middle of talking to the royalty about court, and they will hold their hand up and talk to somebody for 10 minutes. And then you come back to dealing with court. It happens. Okay. Read any ceremonies that are to be used in advance. So this is an important one. As I mentioned before, ceremonies change. And no matter how familiar you are with the ceremonies, refamiliarizing yourself, especially the more complex ones, the peerages and of course, coronation and so on, because it's important to not trip over things if you can help it. Okay, now we're all human. We're all going to make mistakes. We'll talk about mistakes. Okay, but and again, talk to the royalty. And I added on the slideshow, and I'll make the slideshow available. But again and again, you're going to be talking to the royalty all the way up until court starts, and you're going to be talking to the royalty as you go through court. Okay. Remind the royalty before court to visit the privy. Kind of an important one, but again, people get busy, right? Visit the privy yourself. Don't forget to take care of yourself. Make sure that you have water handy, and it should be water, not beer, not coffee, not tea. Well, tea may be okay, but the big thing is a lot of different fluids can be hard on your throat. Okay, and so and of course booze can be problematic again all on its own, right? But water is always safe, and it's always a good idea. And you might be surprised at how dry your throat gets. I've been a teacher for years, and I'll be in the middle of class, and suddenly my throat just goes, and it's like, and I've been drinking water, but somewhere along the line I forgot. I got really involved in talking, and then my throat just went and dried all the way up. And it's like, what are you going to do, right? So remind yourself to drink water. And again, if you have a backup herald, they can nudge you and hand you your cup if there's a break where you're not actually talking, somebody's doing something. But make sure that you've got water handy. Okay, so far so good. Have I gone too fast on anything? Have I covered things pretty well? Just trying to make sure. I know I asked you to keep your mics turned off as much as possible, but I'm just trying to make sure as well. Okay, so during court, this is where things, of course, this is the big thing. So there are standard openings for court. And let me bring that up. I want to bring it up because, let's see here. There are a couple of places this stuff is, but I'm going to do a screen share here. There are some cover pages for the screen share. It's going to be that one right there. Share that. Okay, so opening and closing courts. So when you're doing a procession, you tell everybody to rise, do honor to, and so on. And then there's a whole lot of ifs in here. If the crown prince and crown princess are processing, processing, I should say. If the prince and princess of the mist are processing, if the lord and lady of the mist are processing. Luckily, most of the time, you're not going to have all these people coming into court because there's usually no room for all those people up on the stage, or inside the royal pavilion. But it's important to have something, and having this handy is a useful tool. This is in the ceremony book part of the history site. It's in the cover pages. And the cover pages have the opening and closing bits. So we have, for the king and queen, the procession. Then we come down to the next page, and we have the king and queen teleporting. Okay, basically the royalty seated in court. And so I'll pay heed to the court of their majesties. It's a minor wording difference, and you could probably switch those interchangeably, and it wouldn't bother anybody. But there you go. One of the important things is when everybody's been called into court, that's coming into court, and they've been bowed to, and they've taken their seats, and they've been the royalty have talked to each other and all of that, make sure that you ask the royalty if the populace has leave to be seated. Okay, otherwise the royalty will just be doing their thing, right? And they're not paying any attention, and the populace are still standing because they're being polite, and people can't stand for that long. I mean, it gets really tiring after a while, right? So typically, if the herald just says, does the populace have your leave? And the royalty will almost always say yes, of course, and so on. Then you can say you have their majesty's leave to be seated. And that happens for whatever opening you're doing, okay? Then we also have for prince and princess, the same type of thing, but we always start, if it's the court of the prince and princess, we start with the court of their highnesses, okay? And then if the king and queen are there, then we do the king and queen, and then we do their royal highnesses, and then we do the princesses in order, and if we have other visiting royalty and so on. Okay. So, but otherwise, it's pretty much all the same. Now, I did the baron and baronesses just the other day when I realized that this wasn't in there. Okay, happens, it's like, okay. So we have something here. So we have all rise and do honor to blank and blank, baron and baroness of the barony name. And then again, if the king and queen are processing, if there's a crown prince and princess, if there's a prince and princess visiting, and so on. So you would do these if they're there. Okay, you don't need to do these if they're not there. Now, when you're closing court, it becomes more important to do things a certain way. So, and we'll come back to closing courts again later, but when you deal with closing court, there's certain wording that needs to be done, and we'll come back to it. And again, you deal with the royalty if they're there, if they're not there, and so on. Okay, and we'll talk about some of that. So there's all of these are laid out for you in the cover pages for the ceremony book online. These aren't always printed out in the actual ceremony book, although hopefully they are, but they may not be. Okay, so you can find them on the Herald's website in the court report stuff, or in the court ceremony books. The involvement of the head of court when checking with the royalty. That's an interesting one, and I always forget about it because I've never been a head of court, and so I don't tend to think about the head of court all that much, which is nobody's fault. It's just, we all have our blind spots, right? So the involvement of the head of court when checking with royalty, basically, the head of court is there to when you're dealing with all the business that goes on around the thrones, they kind of are the gatekeeper, If you've got something that you think is really important and you need to talk to the royalty about, well, the court herald kind of needs to talk to the royalty. Okay. Now they may be able to get some information out of the court, out of the head of court, but the head of court may not know. And so you kind of have to work with them, and the head of court can get you in to talk to the royalty. Okay, if the royalty's really busy, the head of court can go, Your Majesty, your court herald's here, whatever. But those are the things that I've ever had to deal with. I don't know if there's anything else that you had in mind, Genevieve.
Unmuted.
Yeah.
No, I just came off serving on a court where we had a super organized, large and in charge head of court. So I just kind of wanted to understand that relationship.
Okay. Yeah. Well, and it's nice when that happens. And it's nice when you have somebody because they can remind the royalty of things and so on. But yeah, as the court herald, you really, because it's about the royalty themselves, the head of court might be able to answer some questions, but for the most part, the head of court is not the person that you need to talk to when you're organizing the court itself. Again, they can get you in to talk to the royalty. Okay, so now, what happens if an officer comes up to you just before court, or worse, during, and I've had this happen, and asks about having a piece of business added? Okay, that one's always a tricky one. My basic feeling on this is, and this is a personal thing, and I think everybody's going to handle this one differently, so I'm just going to mention that. But if somebody comes up to you after court has started, and let's say they're not an officer, it's just they had a presentation that they forgot to talk to somebody about, you can tell them, I'm sorry, but we're in the middle of court, we can't make adjustments at this time. You want to be polite about it. If it's something where it's an officer and they've got something that really needs to be talked about, whether it might be the marshal even needs to talk about something, or whatever, the constable needs to talk about something, whatever. You can then talk to their majesties briefly, tap them on the shoulder while an announcement is happening or whatever. State, your majesty, the constable really needs to make an announcement in court. Is that going to be okay? That kind of thing. Always, again, you want to make sure you have the royalty's permission. Okay, you don't want to just surprise them. That's always a bad idea. Okay. Now, drink water. I mentioned it before, but you need to keep drinking water because your throat will dry up on you so fast if you're not paying attention. Take deep breaths and try to stay calm. I can't emphasize that one enough. One of the hardest things is if you have any kind of stage fright, and we all get it. I mean, I've been doing court for years, And before court, I get a little sweaty, I get a little nervous, and so on. My brain starts falling into the what happens if I do this, that kind of thing. What happens if I screw that thing up, Take deep breaths, stay calm, check your business. It's very easy to accidentally repeat something or whatever. And again, we've all done it. Don't feel bad if you accidentally start something or you accidentally start it wrong or, whatever it happens to be. We're all human. Okay. But check your business, make sure you're on the right piece of business. Okay. Now, again, I want to talk about the ceremony book itself because honestly, a lot of people aren't all that familiar with the way the ceremonies are laid out. So I'm going to go off to the Kingdom Herald's website and go to Court Heraldry and Kingdom Ceremony Book, and then West Kingdom Ceremonies. And I'm gonna, you'll have that information handy. Okay, and I'm going to open up the main PDF, which has everything in it. So it's a complete set of ceremonies. Now I can go back to sharing, stop share, and then screen share back, and I'm going to go to this one right there. Okay, so wow, how did I get? Oh, that's the wrong one. That was really brilliant. I want it to be this one. Are you seeing the West Kingdom Ceremony Book, or did I get the wrong item?
We're seeing the ceremony book.
Okay, so you are seeing the ceremony book. Okay, good. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. So basically, what we've got is the table of contents. And notice as I move the mouse over this is a PDF. As I move the mouse over these are actually clickable links. Okay, so if you're looking at the PDF, I can go straight to a specific ceremony.
Hirsch, we're
Yeah.
not seeing the table of contents.
You're not seeing that? Oh, I must be on the
No,
wrong
you're
one.
still
Okay,
scrolled
let
down
me
on the document.
do a stop share and try that again. West Kingdom Ceremony Book. Do I have it open twice? I must have. Yep, there it is right there. I've got it open twice. Oh, the other one was the opening and closing court. Okay, now you should see the table of contents. So the West Kingdom Ceremony Book and all the Principality Ceremony books do the same thing. They open, if you just look at that PDF, they open on the table of contents. Okay, and if you move the mouse over these, and this will work on a tablet or on your phone or whatever. I've actually done a ceremony using somebody's phone before. That was a little interesting. But these are all clickable links. So I can go directly to a ceremony. So if I go straight to the Order of the Laurel right there, okay, takes me to the Order of the Laurel, and it takes me to the opening page, which has all this stuff in here. You should familiarize yourself if you're going to be doing a laurel ceremony or any peerage ceremony. There's this opening page that has all this information about who's responsible for what. Okay, but you should familiarize yourself with that. Now there are optional openings to the ceremonies, and I'm going to just skim down a little bit. And I just want you to briefly note that we use different font sizes and font weights and different fonts for different purposes. Okay, and until you're familiar with it, it's going to take a little getting used to. The big thing is the royalties lines and the royalties instructions are always big and bold, because they're going to be looking over your shoulder, or they're going to be looking over their shoulder, or even if you shove the ceremony book directly in their face, they still have to be able to read it, and they're not necessarily as familiar with this as you are. Okay, so you can then point to the lines as you go through the ceremony too. This can be very helpful for the royalty. You just point to the line and state, this is your next line. Okay. And notice that there are instructions that are in Times New Roman and so on. We've got alternate things here, master or mistress. Okay. So you would use one or the other. That's why the vertical bar is there. And they're always, I try to be consistent and use a light gray background, okay, just to make sure it stands out a little bit. And this is for the spokesperson, and the spokesperson then has the ability, and there's just kind of an optional, so-and-so has shown great skill, blah, blah, blah. It's just to give an idea of what they might want to say. Okay, so we are minded to admit you, and then the candidate, when whatever words they choose to use, can accept, and so on. Now, with these alternate openings, if you're using the PDF, you can just jump to that page. So this skips over the other 3 alternate openings, goes straight to where you pick up. If they're an apprentice, we have an optional section here with the gray background. You don't have to be an apprentice to become a Laurel, so they may not be an apprentice. Okay, but if they are apprentice, you want to make sure that they are released from whatever part, and so on. You then have more words from the royalty, and this can be changed to queen and king if we end up having a female sovereign and so on. These can be changed easily. Fealty, not everybody wants to swear fealty, which is why it's listed as optional. The only place where it's not optional is for the knights. Okay, so, and again, now here's an important aspect for the fealty. Very few people learn the fealty oath because it's fairly lengthy, and I know when I was in college as a theater major, I hated memorizing lines. I was never very good at it. Okay, I got there, but it always made me a little crazy, as well as my fellow actors. But the idea is that what we've got is smaller font, with the idea being that you as the herald can prompt them, but you don't say it really loudly. You don't state, "Here do I swear." They're the ones who need to be saying it loudly so that the populace can hear them swearing their oath. But you can prompt them by quietly stating, "Here do I swear by mouth and hand," and then move on to the next line. Once they repeat fealty and service, go on to the next line. And it's broken down into lines to make it a little easier. So you're not having to give them, a whole paragraph to try to remember what you told them to say, right? And so you've got all of that. And then the king can look over, or the queen can look over and repeat off of the book as well. Okay, they can just read it directly off the book. So this is an important aspect of the ceremony right here. Yeah.
So Hirsch,
yeah.
Just so I understand it as a new young herald,
sure.
The queen can say any of the lines that the king can say, with the exception of chivalry, where a knight can only make a knight, correct?
Well, depending on the situation, the queen could also be the one who does the fealty. I mean, if that's how the king and queen decided to do it.
Okay, just wanted to double check with that.
The dubbing is the place where
it has to be a knight.
It has to be a knight. Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
But that's the I dubbed thee once, I dubbed thee twice, right, and so on. So, okay.
I just wanted, sorry, Hirsch, I just wanted to put in there, when we redid the ceremony books a few years ago, we deliberately changed the formatting on the fonts to make it very clear who was saying what.
Right.
And noting, the stuff that what's stage direction, what is spoken, what is
right, and that's why we have the different size fonts and the different the actual different fonts and so on, is to make it easier for everybody to know. And we could have a queen. Yeah, that's definitely true, Crystal, that we could easily have a queen who is a knight at some point. We have at least one who is very close. Okay, I would not be surprised to see it in the next year. You never know. I mean, the luck of the day as well. Okay, now we get other stuff. We have, is there a token? And that, again, the king can say it as well. It's usually, we try to split the lines out so that the king and queen are doing different parts, just because, or the sovereign and consort, if you will. So that, but you can do that in different directions. We don't often get a chain or collar given in court, because chains and collars for laurels are fairly expensive. The collars are, if you've ever seen my silver collar, that's a rather expensive piece of jewelry. But they are meant to be used for peers who are in fealty, or meant to represent that, at least at one time. That could probably be debated a lot, but it's still in the ceremony book. So anyway, but the whole idea is that we tried to lay this out with all of this stuff. Now, when it comes to the proclamation, here's the important part with the blazon. There's a place in the ceremony to put on a Post-it note, if you have them, the blazon for somebody's arms, so that you have it right there in the book, okay, for that ceremony. And then when you come down into the scroll part down here, if there's a scroll, you would read the scroll. If there's no scroll, then where it says blazon, okay, this is where you would insert the blazon that's up here. Does that make sense? So that's the idea, is to give you a place to put that. And then, of course, the day and the year, that's why you put that up on the top of your book, right? So you have it easily available. And there are different types of scroll. You know, if there's no scroll, but they already have a patent, you could, you know, they're just confirming the right to bear arms by letters patent. Otherwise, they're granting letters patent. Nobody really worries too much if you don't, if you get the wrong one. Nobody really pays as close attention as you might think to that particular aspect. Usually because at that point, if you've ever paid attention to a peerage ceremony, by the time you get to the proclamation and the scroll, the peers are all hugging the person. They've mobbed them. They're, you know, they're getting their hugs as a new peer and so on. And the herald is trying to read this over the top of all the noise that's being made by the peers greeting their new peer. So they're not really hearing the wording that's in here, but it's kind of important to at least read it out. If you get a scroll you can't read, yeah, the place where that comes up the most is either a very difficult, Crystal Leak, actually, I should read out the question. If you get a scroll you can't read, please ask for translation. It could be that they're using a specific font that or hand that is difficult to read, or it could be something where it's in a different language. Okay, having a translation is very useful for that. Okay, so that you can actually read it out in English so that the rest of us can understand what's being said. Okay, and then there's some other options for the peerages for, you know, which we don't tend to use all that much, but you know, if investiture of the peer will happen at a later date and so on. These have been in the ceremony book for years and years and years. We don't tend to use them much, but there we are. Now I'm going to jump back up to the top of the ceremony book, and again, notice that the footer down here is also a link. It takes you back to the table of contents. Okay, I'm going to go down to let's say the leaf of merit. Okay. Now, there's a whole bunch of stuff at the top of most of the ceremonies, okay? Preparation section, whether there's a scroll or not, and sometimes the royalty work with the scribes and they actually have a scroll handy for a leaf of merit, okay? And the token, okay? So that information is at the top of any ceremony where it's needed, which is most of them. And the ceremony itself is relatively quick. If you'll note, you know, let them come forward, they come forward. You have the main wording for the ceremony, and if there's an award of arms being given, you have this part for the award of arms right here. So you don't have to go switching around to try to find it. It's built into the ceremony, okay? And then there's always the cheers and so on. Now I added recently a herald's note, okay, because people aren't always catching this. If the royalty gives somebody a leaf of merit with an award of arms because they didn't already have one, when it goes into the court report, you need to note leaf of merit / award of arms. Okay, so just as an important point. Okay, so there's that. So, and again, the leaves are all very similar, exactly the same layout. Okay, Baron and Baroness. I always love this one because people have gotten to the point where they know it is the prerogative. At that point, everybody knows it's a court barony, right? It's one of those things that has never changed. So, and again, it's basically the same thing. Court barony comes with an award of arms if they don't already have one. That's kind of rare, but it does happen. Okay, so we have a herald note. Okay, anybody wondered what this was about? You looked at the ceremony book and wondered what hic nihil deficit means? It means nothing to see here. The idea is so that all the ceremonies start on an odd numbered page. So you will have places where there's just a blank page with this at the top of it, okay? And then we come up to the next award and it starts on an odd numbered page, okay? This is just to keep things consistent throughout the ceremony book, okay? So anyway, that was actually a friend of mine who's a bookbinder came up with that, and it just sounded really good because it used to say something like nothing to see here, or it used to say this page intentionally left blank, I think is what I actually had in there. So okay, now we're not going to get into all the details of augmentations and all that. That gets a little crazy, but anyway, so that's just kind of the basics of the way the ceremony book works. And I just wanted to make sure you were at least familiar with the basic layout and so on. So are there any questions about how that works? Anything that you feel like I may have skipped over or something? Everybody good? Let me bring up Zoom itself. Oops, bring up the actual main window. Okay, I'm not seeing any chat notices. Okay. Okay, so I just wanted to double check on that. So I'm going to stop the share on that. Okay. So anyway, so it's very important that you familiarize yourself with the actual ceremony book. If you're looking at doing principality ceremonies, look for the principality ceremony book. They're all different. They all have different awards. They all have different wording. Some of the Ewerthen ones will sound a little bit like some of the Sonogwan ceremonies, because when we were putting together the Ewerthen ceremonies, we were looking at the other two principalities that existed at the time and trying to pull ideas from those. So some of them may sound a bit like the Sonogwan ones, or in a couple cases, maybe some of the Misty ones. But familiarize yourself with the actual ceremonies, okay? Take the time. It's not exciting reading, but it's useful to be able to at least, okay, I remember seeing this, okay, and it helps make it easier as you go. And the more familiar you are, the smoother your court will run. Okay, so let me close that browser window as well. Got a lot of windows open. So, okay, so yeah, okay, I talked about memory. Okay, so I just wanted to make sure. Okay, so now what happens if someone who has been called into court is not in court? Happens all the time. Okay, there are several ways that this can be handled, especially if it's an award. Okay, if it's somebody who needs to make an announcement and they're not in court, kind of on them that they're not there, but somebody may go running to find them or whatever. But if it's for an award, you can ask if there's a representative. This is very useful, especially at the end of a reign and that person isn't at the event, because that royalty will not be able to give that award to that person as soon as they step down, because they're no longer on the throne, right? So you can ask for somebody else to come forward and accept the recognition for them. Okay. If it is known that they're on site, somebody may go charging off. And you see this all the time. Somebody will go charging off and go to their camp because they know exactly where they're at, and then they'll come back later. When something like that happens, however, you suddenly have a dead air issue. Okay, we were talking about dead air earlier. Dead air is literally there's nothing happening because you're waiting, right? That's bad court. It's bad theater. It's bad court. Okay, so what you can do is do a couple of announcements. Move on to the next piece of business. It can be another award, whatever. Yeah, check with the royalty. Make sure that it's okay with them for what you're doing, and you always double check with the royalty. Okay, don't just assume. Okay, but you check with the royalty. Make sure that it's what they want to do, and then you do that. And then when the person has arrived in court, then you can go back to the ceremony that you were going to do, call them into court, do the ceremony, and move on from there. Okay. If it's apparent they're not on site, the royalty may decide to hold off on the award, or again, if it's the end of the reign, they may decide to call a representative or just do the award and then deal with finding the person and getting them their token if there's a token, and all of that good stuff. But, things happen. Somebody might get sick just before the event, whatever. Lord only knows these days. It could be anything. A car dies, all those fun things. Okay, so now, and the most important thing, and I've mentioned this earlier, is that you are not the court jester. Okay, it's not your job to entertain the populace. It's not your job to make jokes. It's not your job to be out there in front doing everything. It's your job to be on the side assisting the royalty. They're the ones that the populace are supposed to be paying attention to. And, we have had some royalty. We've had some heralds who didn't quite get that. People that just got drafted and they just, and it can get interesting, but it can be a problem. So, and the royalty often will just let them do their thing. Maybe because they're a friend of theirs, whatever. But it's really not your job to entertain the populace. Okay. So now, mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes, and like I state, I'm hoping that there will be a little time at the end. I got a couple of really good ones to throw at you if we have time. Everybody makes mistakes when they're doing courts. Nobody's perfect. The biggest thing, unless it's something really egregious, keep going. Okay, if the royalty look at you and ask you about it, you can apologize, but keep things moving. Okay, if you call attention to it, then the populace will notice that you made a mistake, right? Now, if it's a really bad one, I will mention one where I accidentally called. There were two people named Robert on site, and I'd been talking to one of them earlier in the day, but the one who won the tourney is not the person who I called into court. And the people that were called into court were standing there going, "What?" It's like, like I state, things happen. We all make dumb mistakes. At that point, you have to apologize. you do have to apologize for that one, because it's like, yeah. So, and everybody's looking at you at that point. They're looking at them, and they're looking at, and the person that got called into court stood up going, "What? Why am I being called into court?" So, but the big thing is to keep the court flow moving. Okay, mistakes happen. Do what you need to, but keep the court flowing. So there we go. Now, a couple of miscellaneous tips. If you are the herald for court and you get called into court for an award, and the royalty like to do that to their heralds sometimes, remember that if you're wearing a tabard or a cloak or whatever heraldic regalia, you are not the herald when you are called into court for that award. You are the individual, not the herald. Okay, so either take it off if you can, or flip the tabard over your shoulder, something like that, so it's obvious that you are not being called into court as the herald, unless you are. There are parts in coronation where the kingdom herald comes forward, but otherwise, so that's just kind of an important thing, because it's the individual being recognized, not the herald themselves, not the court herald, as in the persona of the court herald. If that kind of makes sense. Okay. Now, humor can be a good thing. People like to laugh, and it's an important thing. But again, it better be funny. And what I mean by that is, if the royalty don't think it's funny, you could find yourself never doing court again. Okay. So be careful if you do have a joke that just trips out of your mouth, or you just have, or there's a pause in court, and it's just a short pause, and you just toss a little one-liner out there, that it's got to be funny. It should not be harmful to somebody. It should not be making somebody look bad, even if there are scapegoats. We've had kingdom scapegoats and so on, but really try to avoid making somebody look bad. It needs to be funny if you decide to do it at all, and I recommend avoiding it for the most part. Okay, because again, what you think is funny is not what other people are going to think is funny. Humor is subjective. Okay, and so what is the process for who will determine who the court herald will be? That works through. That's a good question. There's usually a herald in charge at an event. Okay, if it's a principality event, it's going to be the principality herald for the most part, unless for whatever reason they're not there, but they will designate somebody. At kingdom events, it's going to be the Green Crown Herald and wave at Demir. Anyway, so at smaller events, it's going to be, if it's a baronial event, it's going to be your baronial herald again, unless they designate somebody else to be the person. They're going to be the one, and if you want to volunteer for court, there's usually, at least at the bigger events, there's heralds meetings on Saturday and Sunday mornings. Okay, and you can sign up on a sign-in sheet that says, "I'm interested in doing court." Okay, and that gets to the Green Crown Herald. Okay, now the Green Crown Herald may already know who's doing court because he's talked to people before the event, but it's nice to know that there are people available, because sometimes there may be a spontaneous thing, or they may want to slip you in as a backup herald or a consort side herald. Okay, and a consort side herald is a great place to learn. Okay, you're right there, you're seeing it, right? So it's a great place to be. So that's a really good question. I'll try to remember to slip that into the next time I do something like this. So it's hard to remember all the details, right? So okay, now so humor. Okay, now other tips. Don't forget the cheers. This happens a lot because you get somebody who gets really busy. They're shuffling paperwork. They're getting ready for the next ceremony, and suddenly somebody out in the audience is going hip hip, because the herald forgot to do the cheers for the award recipient. Okay, it makes the herald look bad, But it happens all the time. Okay, so try to remember that it happens to everybody. I mean, but yeah. Another one that's kind of important is let the current folk in court leave before you start the next piece of business. Having people traipsing over each other can be really awkward. Now, where it gets really difficult is a peerage ceremony, right? Because you've got all the peers and whoever else came in with them for their procession, if they did a procession, you've got all of those people, and they need to all get out of court. Now, in a case like that, you might actually be able to start a ceremony, depending on what's going on, and so on, and maybe call that person into court while everybody's processing out. But for the most part, try to give people a chance to leave court. Okay. And you also, some of us are getting older. You're going to have a couple of people who are, moving a little slower. Okay. So, okay. If someone makes a presentation and they insist on doing the presentation themselves, some people will. Okay. Or you'll have a baronial presentation. If you look at some of the information that's in the ceremony book, especially at Kingdom, it actually lists each barony is supposed to do their taxes and all of that stuff once every 2 years, and except for Alicia, which does it once every year because the baron and baroness normally changes every year. Okay. But the idea is that they come in and they do their taxes. They're making a presentation. The problem is usually who's doing the presentation can't be heard by the populace. So the royalty may be oohing and awing over that bottle of beer, or fighting over that bottle of beer that was given to them. And the populace are going, I have no idea. And they're bored. And some of these presentations go on. So the herald can make things better by announcing, they presented their majesties with a bottle of beer, and the king really wants it, but the queen's really interested too, things like that, just to keep the populace involved in what's going on with the presentation. Because otherwise they're going to get bored, and court can get really boring if you don't keep the populace engaged. Okay, so, and that's one of the hardest parts of doing some of this, is keeping the populace engaged, which is part of why people will chime in with the hip hips for an award if the herald forgets it. Is they're trying to be engaged. They expect to do the cheers at the end of the ceremony. Okay, at the end of court, very important, when you get to the last piece of business, check with the royalty. Some of them will tell you up front that they're going to have words for the populace. Some of them won't. They'll just expect to be asked. Okay. Check with the royalty. Make sure that they've been given a chance to talk to the populace. Sometimes they don't want to. They're done. They've been in court for an hour and a half. They want to go have a beer. They want to go to the potty. I mean, whatever it happens to be. They just want to get out of the court, out of the royal pavilion, right? So you check with the royalty, and then you always use the standard phrase, there being no further business before this court. That's an important phrase, because if you state, is there any further business, somebody will come up with something. It happens all the time, which is why we started using there being no further business. Okay, that makes it very plain and clear, we're done. And then you go into the cheers for the closing of court. And that's in that same set of documents that I showed you. There's the closing of court, and it lays it out. Long live the king. And you always cheer the king and queen and the princes and princesses, even if they're not present. If they're present, you cheer them first. And then if you have like the prince and princess of the Miss, but you don't have the other two sets of royalty, you would do long live the other princes and princesses of the West, and then you roll right into the hip hips, because you don't want the populace to stumble over, long live all the other princes and princesses of the West. They will trip over that, and they will do their best to get there, but it gets a little awkward. Okay. Okay, so Crystal Lee has a question about there may be times when the royalty need to pause court unexpectedly, or one of them needs to step out. A lot depends on the circumstance. If they need to just hold court for a moment for some reason, and it could be, God forbid, an ambulance on site, whatever, that's an emergency, right? Demir pops up with Bard. You can call in the Bard. That's one option if the Bard's there, or a Bard, if not the Principality or Kingdom Bard or whatever. You can maybe do some announcements. There's a lot of different things that you can do. If you've got announcements sitting there on your sheet, you can throw those in while you know the royalty while you know, let's say the consort has to run off to the privy for a moment because you know it happens. So I want a pokeball that summons a bard. Yeah, that might be handy at times. Yeah. So anyway, yeah, that's a good question though, because these, you know, things happen and you can't plan for everything. I mean, you know, things are going to happen. So emergencies come up, whatever. So yeah, let's see. Standard cheers. Okay. So let's see. Standard closing cheers, and yeah, that's on. Looking at all my notes. Okay. So far so good. That's kind of gone all the way through doing the court. But there's more, because of course, once court is over, there's still more stuff that the Herald gets to do. So I want to just check the time. Wow, I'm actually doing okay on the time. Okay. So one of the most important things I want to double check on with people is during court, and you've probably seen this, you'll have the arts and sciences officers come forward and state, these are the victors. You know, we had the competitions today, and this person was the winner, but they didn't give you that information before court. That happens a lot because they may not know. Okay, right up until court happens, they may not know who the winner is. You also have issues with, say, the Muck and Great Klug, and things like that. There are various awards that the person who is handing off the award may actually be in court. They may do it in court, but they don't realize they need to talk to the Herald, and because this has to go into a court report. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, and so what you need to do is you're responsible, if you haven't gotten that information before court, to go find those people, which may not be easy. You may need to send out runners to go find people. Okay, because the winners of the competitions, some of them actually have awards. The Pied d'Argent and so on have awards, and those need to go into the court report. And if you don't know who the winner is, you can't put their name in, right? And sometimes, again, you know, the person who's running the competition doesn't realize they need to tell the Herald, you know, and sometimes the Herald is so busy they don't have time to write it down. I mean, you know, while it's happening, you know, they're trying to find the next ceremony. They're trying to do whatever, get a drink of water, you know, whatever. So these are specific items that you need to be aware of. And I do want to point out, and this is actually listed in the instructions for the court report. There is an actual page on the Herald's, on the awards list site for regional notes. And regional notes breaks down to kingdom, the principalities, and the baronies that have special cases for specific things. Okay, not all the baronies have special cases, but all of the principalities have some award where you need to be very specific how you give the information. Okay, and so you should try to find the time to go over that, just because, especially if you're doing a principality court or whatever, go over that and just make sure, okay, there's things like, you know, the bard, and there's all these other things. Make sure you know that there are specific things that you might need to do. Ruxton, the Ruxton has a number. You need to put the number in the court report. You know, things like that. So, you know, that kind of thing is kind of important. So, and I will remind you if you don't do it, you know, but I'd rather not have to remind people if I can avoid it. You know, the less work I have to do. I got plenty to do as it is. So, anyway, so let's see. Yeah, so I just, and the most important thing though is the things like the various competition winners and so on, because often you don't get the name during court. You know, the Herald doesn't get the name, and it's very frustrating because then you have to go find it. But it's kind of on you to make sure you have that information. Okay. So after court, very important. If you're an inexperienced Herald, ask for feedback. Come up to people that you respect and tell them and ask them, how do you think I did? Are there things I could improve on? Where, you know, when I made that mistake, did anybody notice? A lot of people may not, you know, but you know, that's kind of important. But the other side of that is, if you're an experienced court Herald, the feedback can still be useful. We all have, you know, things that we screw up on. I mean, you know, we're all human, right? But the inexperienced Herald really needs to be willing to take that feedback. Now, the hard part with asking for feedback is you may not like what you hear. So be prepared, put on that thicker skin, Okay, and just take it as constructive criticism, because that's really what everybody's trying to do when that happens, is they're trying to be constructive, they're trying to be helpful. Okay, so, but definitely ask. You know, you can learn a lot just by having somebody tell you, you did really good at this, and this part right here, you could work on that a little bit, you know, whatever. But you know, any little bit of advice that you can get from somebody that can help you do a better job the next time you do court is useful, right? So, so there's that. Okay, now the court report. So, very important with the court report. I've had people lose their details for a court and have it surface 3 months later because they're in the middle of a bunch of stuff and it ends up in a pile of paper, and then more paper gets piled on top of it, and then suddenly months later they find it. And they go, is it okay if I put this in? Yes, of course that's okay. It's important that we have it. Okay, but the sooner you can do this, the better. I don't expect, just so that you know, I'm also the Gollum Herald, the guy who handles the awards list. So, but anyway, I don't expect people to turn in the court report the same day that the court happens. It's cool when it happens. Sometimes you'll get a herald who's really good at doing it on their phone, or they go back to their hotel room, or they, you know, whatever, or they just go straight home and they do it right away as soon as they go home. That's great when it happens. I don't expect it. Okay. The kingdom has a law that says they have to be done in the court report system within 9 months of the court. 9 months is a long, long time. People who get their recognitions and don't see them showing up in the awards list get frustrated after a couple of days sometimes. Okay, so those people, you kind of go, calm down, you know, court herald's busy, you know, things happen. But basically the big thing is do the court report as soon as you can. Okay, that way you don't forget it. The most important part of it is once you've done the court report, you've entered all the information and you've submitted it, don't throw that paper away. There may be questions. Okay, maybe there was something in your handwriting and we need to check the spelling, you know, whatever. These things happen. This is just, again, it's people, you know. So, all right. The court report goes to a variety of people. And if you've ever done a court report, you will have seen that this goes to a mailing list, okay? It goes to the royalty. If there are errors, it goes to the heirs. Okay, that way the heirs know what's going on, right? And they also get familiar with this process, okay? The Kingdom Chronicler gets a copy of it because it goes into the page, okay? Very importantly, obviously, I get a copy of it because I'm the one who ultimately puts this into the court, into the awards list, okay? This is all done through email. And the fun part about it being done through email is there are people who don't check their email regularly. Or what sometimes happens is things end up going off into a spam or junk folder, and people don't look at those all that often. Okay, so if you have submitted a court report and the royalty have not acted on it, and I haven't said anything, you might nudge the royalty. Okay, contact them, state your majesties, you know, have you seen that court report? And if it went into their junk folder, well, that's what happened, right? Or maybe they just got busy, and again, maybe they're not checking their email on a regular basis. Okay. Crystal Leak put out a note here that says take a photo of the court and note reports and leave it in a folder on your phone. That can be useful. Okay. Some people aren't that tech savvy, but you know, if it works for you, that's a useful tool. Okay, we have a lot of different tools that are useful for people these days. Now, when the court report comes through, the royalty's job is to check for errors, to check for missing things. Things happen. You know, maybe you're working off of a list. Let's say you're doing the Queen's Guard, and somebody ended up not being in court that day. But you're going off the list that you were given at the beginning of court, right? And it's not your job to note that somebody wasn't there, except that, you know, ultimately it kind of is. But if you forgot, you know, you didn't cross their name off or whatever, it's up to the royalty to go, oh, that person wasn't in court. We're going to get them at another event. Okay, so that ends up being taken care of. Yeah, I'm going to show you the court report form and all that. Genevieve asked if there's a standard template and so on. Yeah, I'm going to actually bring up the court report and actually fill in a bogus court report. Okay, I'm actually going to send it too. Okay, So the royalty that get it will have to be told, please ignore this. Okay. But basically, the royalty's job is to review the court report when it comes in. If everything's good, all they have to do is state, I confirm that this is good. We're good. I take care of it. I start putting awards in. The chronicler gets to put it into the page. Okay. But it's only after it's been confirmed by the royalty. Okay. This is a multiple step process intentionally, so that we have a check and balance. It's not that I expect anybody's cheating, but things happen. And again, mostly it's usually a mistake. Again, human error. Somebody forgot something, or whatever it happens to be. Okay, so the court report form. So I'm going to go to that, and again, I'm going to go. It's on the Herald's website. There's links to it in several places on the Herald's website. So I'm going to now share this form. And oops, wrong window. Zoom always gives me two windows, which is always a little weird. Okay, so I want to share the court report form. I've got so many windows open. I knew this was going to happen. Okay, that one right there. Share that window. You should be seeing the court report. Okay, so notice at the very top, in this blue box at the very top, it tells you fill in the information as requested. If you need more names, we'll come back to that. I actually should change the wording on that. I fixed this a while back, but there are instructions. So there's a link here which gives you some very detailed instructions on filling this out. But if you look at the screen, most of it's pretty straightforward. If the court report is coming from the Crown, it's going to fill in the current royalty right there. Okay. If I change this to, I'll go to Awertha, it changes this automatically to the current royalty in Awertha. If I change this to Alicia, it changes it. Okay, but there's a full list there. These are in order. These are in reverse order of reign. Okay, so the most recent ones are at the very top. Okay, so now when I was talking earlier about the email thing, if you're doing a coronation or an investiture or a baronial changeover, and you're doing the court for the outgoing royalty, it's important to get their email addresses, at least one of them, if not both of them. Most of the time, the consort is better about answering the court reports, but sometimes the sovereign is very on top of it as well. So if you can get both of them, that's very useful. Okay, you would enter those in these two fields. If you don't have to worry about it, if it's the current royalty, you're good. Okay, so if you're doing March Crown, you don't have to worry about it. Okay, but it's very important that we get those for the coronation events, because the IT department for the West Kingdom, after 7 days, removes the outgoing royalty from the email list. Does that make sense? I hope. Okay. I'm just double checking here. Okay. Now, down here, we get the date, and it's the modern date, and you can bring up a calendar like you would expect on most web forms these days. And we can, but if I notice that if I go out to something in the future, you can't select an event from the future. You can go further back. You can go back to 12th night if you needed to, for example. The SCA year is automatically filled in here, but also you really don't have to worry about the Roman numeral year, because that will be fixed if you get it wrong. The code will actually regenerate that information when it's emailed out. Now, the name of the event is useful. If there's only one court at an event, you don't need to put anything in here for the court description, but if you have multiple courts, it's just useful for the royalty to know which event, which court they're looking at. Okay, so having some sort of a note here is useful. The court herald's name, the court herald's email address. If somebody else is submitting the report, if you as the court herald are not comfortable submitting the court report, you can ask the Seawolf Herald, if it's a Principality of the Mists event or whatever, to do the court report for you. Or if you're having issues with your internet connection, or whatever the situation is. But you can then put their information in here, or they can put their information in here. Okay, so that's the heading part of the court report. Any questions about any of that? So I'm going to use Donovan and Ermengerdes. I know Ermengerdes is sitting out there, so she will know to ignore this. But anyway, so we're going to do a quick court report for them. So we're going to assume Baron Eve Alicia, this court Baron and Baroness. I'm going to put this back to today's date. Test court for class. Okay, and I'm going to put in Hirsch. Normally you would want to put your full SCA name in, but okay. And again, if there was a submitting Herald, you would do all that. Now, we come further down the page, and there's this huge block of more instructions. Okay, and that's because there's a lot going on with the way the awards list works. So double check the spelling of names. If you don't know that you've got the correct spelling, you can go to the awards list name search, and I'm not going to bring it up, but it's pretty easy to use, or the Kingdom History site's Who's Who. Anything that's registered will actually be the absolutely correct spelling as we know it. Okay. If it's not registered, it'll be whatever spelling we happen to have if they're in there. Some people aren't in the Who's Who; they're not in the awards list yet. Okay, we'll talk about that in a moment. I have a note here to group the awards of the same type together. Now, this is kind of useful if you have 3 leaves of merit, even if they're scattered throughout the court. You do 1 leaf of merit at one point and 2 at another point. Group them together, and then alphabetize the names if you can. Okay, don't sweat it too much, but it's kind of useful. It makes it easier on my eyes when I'm looking to make sure I entered everything into the awards list. Okay. Now, notice that the way the information is entered is the name of the award goes in the first column, and the recipient goes in the second column. It's very important you get them in the correct order. Okay. And notice that for the leaf of merit here, I only have to put that in once here. Then I've got 2 more down here that are also leaves of merit. I don't have to put it in for each one of those. The program, I feel rather intelligent about this, but the program is designed to look and make sure that it's grouping things. Okay, so if they're grouped together like this, it automatically knows that all of these are leaves of merit. Okay. Now, if they got a scroll in court, you can also check it off here. Okay. Now, not everybody gets a scroll in court, but if you are paying attention, you might want to note if they got a scroll. If it's a peerage and they got a scroll for their peerage, you might want to note it. Okay, this is useful for the scribes, because that way they don't end up doing a scroll a second time. It's happened. Okay, so if we have the ability to state they got a scroll, then we don't need to worry about it. Okay. Now, try to alphabetize the list. Again, it's not too worried. If the award is numbered, and again, the Ruxton, the Pillar of the West, include the number for that recipient. And I mentioned earlier a bit about regional notes. There's a link to it right there. Okay, that'll bring up a page that describes all these different things. Okay, so there's a link to regional notes here. Notice I mentioned the scroll checkbox. If multiple forms are used, and again, most of the time, because of the way I've made some changes to this, you don't really need to use multiple pages for the same court. We'll take a look at that in a moment. Okay. If there's a reaffirmation, and if you need to, we can talk about reaffirmations later, but sometimes an award needs to be reaffirmed because it didn't get into the awards list in time. Okay. There's a specific wording that's useful. Reaffirmation, it's an award of arms. From Fred and Wilma and so on. And this goes in the awards and honors column here, and then the name of the recipient would still go in over here. Okay. So if Fred the Lame was getting their leaf of merit as a reaffirmation, it would say reaffirmation, leaf of merit. It would give the royalty that gave it, and it's the king and queen who gave it. And that's important because the principalities can also give leaves of merit, right? And the date. Okay. You don't have to worry too much about the FCA date, but the actual real world date. Okay. Don't worry about the length of the text. It'll fit. Even if it scrolls off, it'll fit. Okay. And there's an example down here of what that might look like. The regional notes again, and there's another link to it. And there's a notes area at the bottom of the page, and we'll take a look at that in a bit. Okay. So here's the actual part where you would enter everything. So I'm going to go Sea Lion's Tail. I don't think Alicia has a Sea Lion's Tail award, but I'm just making this up. Okay. Okay. And then, okay, just coming up with some simple stuff here. So 2 people got the sea lion's tail. Okay. And then, let's say the friend of the Marini goes to Hirsch and then to Alazan. And normally you would use their full names, but I'm just making this up real quick. And if they got a scroll for it, you might check that and so on, okay? So basically you fill this in and you fill it in. If you've got a lot of stuff, notice that there are only 30 lines, okay? So the 30 lines is because at a certain point this is all coded. So I'm having to write code to deal with lots of lines was a little tricky and daunting when I first put this together. I eventually figured out I can add 10 rows. I can add another 10 rows. If you're doing coronation and you have Queen's Guard, Queen's Artisans, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, you can do it all in one court report. This will keep going until you can put everything in that you need to. Okay? This was something, once I figured it out, I went, oh my God, and you can see how quick it happens. You don't even see it redraw, just there they are, right? Now, there's a special option here. This came about because of the award that was given at the end of COVID that had over 120 recipients. And trying to enter all that information into this form when the Herald already had a list in Word. Well, the idea is in a case like that, and only in those cases, okay, you can do a Word document. Okay, and if you're using something like LibreOffice or Google Doc or whatever, you can save it out as a Word document. Okay, when you do that, there's instructions and so on. You can attach the file. However, if you do that for 10 items, I'm going to tell you to put them in the court report form. I'm going to make you do it. Okay, just because it's this has got a very specific purpose. Okay. There's a notes field. This is really useful to make notes about things. Let's say, for example, Fred the Lame has never been in the awards list that I can find. Fred is male. His modern name is let's see, and they live in Alicia. Okay, just so that information is there. This helps me out a lot because there's information that goes into both the awards list and the who's who. Okay, and so having this kind of information is very useful. You can also put other information in here. Their excellencies. And whatever, other stuff that may not need to be in the court report itself, but just things that might be useful. If the chronicler sees that, they might end up putting it into the page, things like that. So, but it's useful for a lot of different things. Now, we did have a case recently where somebody had copied something out of Excel, and so we ended up with a table embedded in here, and that actually stopped the court report. It didn't submit all of it. It submitted part of it, which was even weirder. But it stopped the court report, okay? So basically don't do that. Don't put web addresses in here because I got a spam trap because there's too many people out there doing spam bots and all that stuff, okay? Now, once you've done this, the idea is to go back, double check everything, make sure you spelled them correctly. If you've had time to go back and look at something and find their name after you had done the original info, whatever. And then at the very bottom, because the way that web forms work, if you press enter, they automatically submit. If you have a submit button, I disable the submit button. So in order to enable it, you have to click this checkbox. Okay? Because people will accidentally hit the enter button, enter key on their keyboard. Okay, it happens all the time, right? So once you do that and you click send report, it's going to take it a moment because it has to build the email and send it through a server. Okay, but notice it didn't take all that long. Okay, you should see this. If you see anything other than all of this information, you'll get an error message or you'll get something up here that will tell you there was a problem. Okay, so it tells you it's coming from going to courtesy copies. So these are all the people that are getting copies of this email, okay? But the subject is the date it was submitted. This information actually is in the court report when it comes through. You get all this stuff at the top of the page, and then again, it's repeated here. This is actually usually copied into the page itself, so when the chronicler can actually just copy that, okay, and just paste it into the newsletter. This is what happens when you have multiple award recipients with the same award, okay? Notice that they're both listed, but you have the heading, which is the name of the award, and then this information, and if a scroll was given in court, we get that, okay? And then there's the notes that you put in down here, okay? And it tells you at the very bottom success. Now, if you need to if you need to continue that report, which normally, again, because you can add to the report, you don't need to, but you can do this, and it will basically fill in everything at the top of the page, okay? So if I do continue report, it comes back up and it fills everything back in up here. So if you needed to do page 2, you don't have to fill all that back in. Or if you needed to do another report for the same day from the same royalty for a different court, do second court, right? All that information is there, okay, except for what you need to change. Then you can come down here and fill in the awards, okay? So now if you do a new report with that button that says new report, it clears everything out. It just clears out everything at the top of the form. So that's what happens when you fill in the court report and you submit it, okay? So what I now want to do is show you what it looks like when it comes through. So I'm going to do a stop share. I'm now going to go to Outlook and bring up the court report that just got submitted, which it should show up any moment now. Come on, there it is right there, okay. I'm going to open that in its own window so that you can see the court report. Okay, so back to screen share, and it's that one right there. Share that. Okay, so now you're seeing what it looks like in email. Now this is Outlook. Of course, every email program looks a little different, but this is basically what you get. And I always print these, okay? And this is so I can go back and look at them, okay, if there's a case of a question. But it has everything that you saw on that web page, just like that. And there's a note for the royalty. Please check the notes at the bottom. Sometimes there are questions. Please verify these awards, and please use the reply to all or reply all option. Sometimes the royalty will just do a simple reply, and then nobody else gets the response. So the chronicler doesn't know that it's been confirmed, all of that stuff. Reply all, make sure that everybody gets it, okay? So now, when they do that, that's when I go to the actual awards list and enter the information. And it is manual, but it's not that hard. I mean, I've got search routines to find people, and I've got all kinds of stuff that make it a lot easier. But the idea is that it doesn't get done until the royalty actually confirm this report. Any questions? It's a pretty good system when it works. It's only when it breaks that we have problems. It doesn't break very often. So, okay, I'm going to do a stop share. Okay, so Genevieve, did that answer your question about a standard template?
No, you're good. You're good. Thank you.
Okay, you bet. Well, I just wanted to make sure. You might have had something else in mind, so I just wanted to make sure. Okay, so miscellaneous stuff. So that's the whole process for getting, once you're done with submitting the court report, unless there's a question that you need to answer, which sometimes I will respond and answer and ask a question, or I'll make some corrections or whatever. Unless there's a question that you actually need to answer, you're done with that court at that point. So once the court report's submitted, unless there's a question, you're good. Okay? Whew. It's a lot of stuff, right? Don't let it daunt you. The first couple of times it might be a little unnerving or a little scary, but honestly, I don't bite. The royalty are really appreciative when the heralds get it done. So don't let it unnerve you. Don't let it scare you. Yeah. Do I have a successor? No, I don't. I have actually looked at trying to find people, and I get people kind of vaguely interested, and then they fall off the face of the earth or something. So I basically am working out here, on a tightrope right now. If I get hit by a bus, well, luckily most of this stuff is fairly straightforward, but I would like to have somebody I can train. Okay, so miscellaneous. So there's a couple of other things. So one of the big ones is, and this happened, and this one is important to me because this actually happened in Owertha when I was a Stella Nordica Herald. The king and queen came, and they were giving a Queen's Order of Grace, and they did not have the ceremony book. And I didn't have the ceremony book, and we were off in a place where, well, first off, we didn't have access to the internet, and the ceremonies weren't up online because there was no online at that point. And so we couldn't just go out and grab a copy of the ceremonies off the website. Okay, so what ended up happening was a couple of people, including the Kingdom Seneschal, who was at the same event and was also a member of the Queen's Order of Grace, sat down and kind of created a ceremony that sounded a lot like the Queen's Order of Grace ceremony. It wasn't exactly the Queen's Order of Grace ceremony, but it was close. Okay, so if you know that the royalty are coming, then what you can do to prepare, because sometimes the royalty get busy. If you have somebody who has a baby, they may forget something, things happen, right? You can go out, if you know they're going to be here, be at your event. There's actually, let me bring this up. I've got a link available. I just need to go down to that. Okay. In the Herald's Handbook, this is only for Kingdom, but you can also do something similar for a Principality. In the Herald's Handbook, there's an article, and make sure I get the right one. That one right there. Okay, share that. Okay, and this article is basically aimed at, rather than reformatting these, all of the ceremonies are broken out as individual ceremonies. And this is useful for somebody who has been offered membership in one of the orders of peerage, or it's also just useful for a herald who's in a faraway branch. I recommend that you, if you're a herald that is going to be doing court and the royalty might be visiting, you print out these ceremonies. Okay, and that's because that way you got them in case something happens. You've got at least one copy handy. Does that make sense? You can also download them. If you just want to, you can right click on some of these and save the link as, which will save it, and so on. But the idea is to make it possible to actually have the ceremonies handy, so you're actually using the real ceremony. Okay. So, and these are the ones that are most likely the ones that you might need. Now, there are other ceremonies in there. There's lots of awards that are given less often. If the royalty are going to be there and they let you know in advance that they're planning on giving a specific award, you can actually go out to the full ceremony book on the web. And again, all of the ceremonies are broken down into individual PDF files. So you can print just a specific ceremony. If you know the Prince and Princess of Sinagua may be giving a Ruxton, you can print the Ruxton ceremony. And you don't have to print all of the Sinaguan ceremonies, that kind of thing. So, but I would recommend, and it's also a way for you to have a chance to just sit down and read them, get familiar with the ceremonies in general. But that's the idea of having that particular article. And at one time, we actually had all of this in the ceremony, in the Herald's Handbook. Well, there's Panda. Wow. There's Panda right there. So, okay. So does that make sense? Did I lose anybody? Kind of hard to tell. That's the one problem with having all the mics turned off is it's hard to tell. So, all right. Let's see. Yeah, again, for the principalities, if you know the prince and princess are likely to be there, you might want to print some of the more common principality ceremonies. In theory, the royalty should always have a copy of the ceremony book with them. But again, things happen, okay? So let's see. The last thing I was going to throw out here, besides a quick bibliography, is a couple of there I was stories. So just to show you that the weirdest things can happen, and there are lots of different ways to handle them. The first time that I did a court for the king and queen was when I was up in Owertha. I wasn't Stella Nordica yet. As a matter of fact, we weren't even a full principality yet. And the king and queen came up, and the person who was supposed to do the court was also supposed to be sitting on the throne as the Lady of the Snows in Owertha at the time. And the Lord Defender told her just before court, "You are going to be sitting on the throne." And she turned to me as her backup herald and said, "I guess you're doing court." So I'm standing here going, and I did court, and for the most part, I did okay. But the first group of awards of arms, we did like 3 awards of arms at one time because there were a bunch of people that needed to get awarded. The first 3 people that came up, and they're kneeling, and I start the ceremony, and I state, "Whereas you have greatly enriched the realm," and I paused for a moment, and my apprentice, who was sitting front row, was covering her mouth and trying not to laugh out loud. And I paused. I looked over at the king. He looked straight forward and did not say a thing. And I moved on and I finished the ceremony. And of course, I'm probably turning beet red as well, right? Embarrassed because I made a really stupid mistake and I told some people that they had done something really bad. I mean, enriching the realm is not enriching the realm, right? So I told myself, "You're not going to say enriched again." And I'm muttering this to myself, "Don't say enriched again." And I called up the next 3 people and I did it again. At which point my apprentice almost fell out of her chair trying not to laugh. And again, the royalty were very cool about the whole thing. This was Radnor. I mean, he was very cool about the whole thing. And I moved on and I finished the ceremony. And except for my apprentice, as far as I know, nobody else noticed. I mean, the king and queen may have noticed. They never said anything to me later. So, but that's the big thing is don't call attention to it if you can help it. I mean, if it's something, again, if you call out the wrong name and the wrong person starts to come into court and you have to go, "Oh, I'm so sorry," and so on. At that point, you do kind of need to apologize because, but if you can manage to not have to, and now I did actually go to a couple of the people that got their awards of arms and apologize for the bad wording. But everybody kind of laughed it off and nobody was upset. Now the other one is one that's really spectacular in its own way, but it wasn't me this time. This was Maxim Fidelis years ago. He's one of the ones I cited from an article from earlier. He was a guy who had an FM voice. He had a presence. He was one of these people that was just the perfect court herald, and everybody who was a court herald wanted to be Maxim, because he was that kind of a guy, right? He had the voice, he had the carriage, he just had the aplomb, and he had the ability to do things off the top of his head that were spectacular and so on. So this is the first kingdom court that I ever been at Central Kingdom, and I'm backing Maxim, and he's getting ready to close court after having done Grun's countess ceremony and rattled off this cheer in German that had everybody kind of going, "Whoa, that was really cool," right? And then he starts to close the court of Paul and Verena. Now, if you know anything about the history here, Paul and Rowena were the ones on the throne. James and Verena only ever reigned with James. Okay, the whole court cracks up. I mean, everybody except for Paul. They're just laughing their butts off. And this is Paul. He takes things seriously, right? So he's sitting on the throne just kind of looking. Maxim hands me the ceremony book very carefully. I set the ceremony book down, and then he takes off the tabard, hands it to me. I fold it up and put it down. And then he stands up straight, walks to the front of court in a straight line, does a military turn, does another military turn, fell on his face, and crawled to Paul's feet. And apologize, I'm so sorry, mea culpa, mea maxima culpa, just the whole thing. Gotta forgive him after something like that. I mean, oh my God. Of course, James came up and said, "I'm not sure if I should be insulted or not." So, but anyway, so, if it's a really spectacular one, well, you can apologize in a spectacular way. I mean, so, but, so I'm sure anybody who's done court will have stories over time. So if you talk to people, we've done at Collegia, where, heraldic collegiums and stuff, where we've done classes where the last like half hour of class is everybody telling their horror stories. Because again, we all have them. We're all human. We all make these dumb mistakes. It's how you deal with it, right? That's the big thing, is how you deal with it. Maxon managed to make a good joke out of his. I was able to kind of gloss over it with the one that I gave. I've had a couple of other real doozies, but we don't have time to really, go into everything. So, I could go on for a while for some of the dumb mistakes I've done. Like I say, we all have them, right? So, okay. Well, that was everything that I had. The notes that I've got, I'm going to put the PowerPoint presentation on the Herald site, both in PowerPoint and in PDF file format. So if you don't want to actually deal with PowerPoint, you don't have to. Or if you don't have Office on your computer, whatever. There's a bibliography which has links to a bunch of stuff that I've talked about throughout the class, including the regional notes page, the cheat sheets for opening and closing court, the ceremonies pages, and so on. And that's pretty much it. So unless you have questions, and I'm willing to take some questions. So I got a thank you from Crystal Lee in the notes. But I'm willing to take questions if anybody has anything. I'm sure that there's probably something that I missed, or maybe I didn't cover as well as you might have liked to hear, or something.
Well, you know me, Hirsch. I can't get enough of asking questions. So
that's it. I appreciate it, really. I mean, questions.
So here's another one for you. Can you talk a little bit more about the concept of the backup herald?
The backup herald. Okay. Well, the backup herald is there for multiple purposes. One of them is, what happens if you blow your voice out, right? It's nice to have somebody who can just pick things up and keep going, right? But mostly the backup herald is there to help you. So if you're in the middle of things and you've got the ceremony book and a list of your court business and a bunch of announcements, you may have a lot of paper to juggle, right? So sometimes it's kind of nice to be able to turn around to the backup herald and hand them the ceremony book while you just deal with the announcements, or things like that. The backup herald can also be listening to what you're doing, and if they hear your voice starting to go, they can hand you a cup of water, kind of force you to drink something, that kind of thing. There can be a lot of different purposes, and if you suddenly need a consort side herald, you can send and there's nobody over on the other side of the throne, you can send the backup herald over to do the consort side for a moment, then they can come back, things like that. So they're really kind of an auxiliary herald meant to be there in case you need them, more than anything else. I mean, that's really just, and it's very helpful, especially for the longer courts. When I was Stella Nordica up in Owertha, actually, I have some water. When I was Stella Nordica in Owertha, I was able to, because of smaller events, I mean, Owertha tournament will have, at a big tournament, we'll have 15 to 20 fighters. They may be bigger these days. I haven't been to one for a while. Catriona could tell me, but anyway, they would be 10 fighters, 15 fighters, and you knew all of them. So I didn't need to have the phonetic spelling. I knew how to pronounce their names because I knew these guys, partied with them, did all the stuff. So I could do court, I could do duty shouts, I could do field, I could do all the voice heraldry for the whole event and still have a voice for Bardic Circle. Okay. At a kingdom event, you can't really do that. Okay. And at most principality events, you can't really do that because there's just too much. You can't have one person doing it all. And so having that backup herald is there as a relief and very helpful in general. So hopefully that gives you at least a better feel.
They're also useful for passing comments, passing notes, if you will, between the crown side and the consort side, the sovereign and the consort side.
Yeah.
Useful for refilling your water.
Yeah.
Fanning you if you have a situation where, like we had at summer investiture in Sinagua, where the air conditioning wasn't working very well and it was 100 degrees outside.
So yeah,
things like that.
Yeah, they can be it can be very helpful to have one. And again, it's for a shorter court. If you know you've got 5 pieces of business, you probably don't need a backup herald. But it's when you get into the longer courts, opening court for some events can be fairly lengthy, but the evening court is usually the big one for a lot of the principality and kingdom events. And then of course Sunday will vary depending on what happens in the peerage meetings, amongst other things. So yeah, but for the longer courts, a backup herald is a really useful person to have handy. So, and again, for the backup herald, it's a useful learning tool. One of the best things about being a court herald, and I'm going to, I think it's in my notes somewhere, but one of the best things about being a court herald is that you're right there seeing award recipients get their awards, and you get to see the look on their faces, and that is so cool. It is just, because everybody else is seeing their backs, right? And so you are right up there in front. You get to see their face. You get to see the look of joy, the look of surprise, especially, for some people where they're just completely not expecting that court barony, whatever it happens to be. And the look of absolute shock on their face is something that the herald and the royalty get to enjoy, and most people don't, so, and that's kind of a perk all on its own for being a court herald. So, okay, any other questions?
It's not a question, but I'll confirm that we have on average between 8 and 15 fighters entering an Orphan Coronet still.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, it hasn't changed a whole lot. I know that sometimes it's been bigger, but sometimes it's smaller. So, it's one of those fun things. So, okay. Anybody else? All good?
Not a question, but a comment and a handy tip, if you will. If you are going to be printing out your own copies of the ceremony books, especially the Kingdom Ceremony book, with the Kingdom Ceremony book, do yourself a favor, split it. There are ceremonies that are only required for coronations and for invocation. You don't want that stupid binder. That thing's almost an entire ream of paper.
Oh yeah, it's huge. Yeah,
it's heavy. Yeah. It is heavy. Well, I keep my own copy of the coronation ceremonies, just the coronation ceremonies by themselves in a separate binder, because it is that heavy, and you're standing there holding that thing for an hour for a coronation.
Yeah.
Your arm gets tired.
Another thing that can help if you have the ability is duplex printing.
Yes.
Yeah, but that's of course.
But even duplex printing.
Yeah, even with duplex printing, it's still a lot
heavy.
paper, but it does cut it down. But yeah, they are the Kingdom ceremony book is really big. The principalities aren't exactly small, but they're
smaller.
Yeah, and again, the coronation ceremony is rather hefty. But that's because there's so much going on.
And you're only going to need the coronation ceremony 3 times a year.
Right. And if you're somebody who's out in Alicia and you don't come into the big kingdom events, you're not going to be doing a coronation except for the times that Herb happens to end up there. And even then it's mostly likely to be a kingdom herald. So pick and choose the ceremonies. Again, if you know that the royalty are going to be doing specific things, if the royalty think to contact somebody in advance, which they often don't. But if they manage to be that together, then you know which ones you might need. But still, it's handy to have some of the others available as well. And having them in PDF format is also handy. Because then you can just look at them on a smaller device. And
I'm contemplating getting a new iPad, partly so that I can download the whole thing onto an iPad and then just have a period looking cover for it.
Yeah, I actually did for Christopher and God, I'm drawing blanks on names.
Maura.
Yeah, Mariah. God, Christopher and Mariah, and they're really good friends. Anyway, I always love when that happens. Anyway, I ended up doing a ceremony at an arts and sciences event off of her cell phone. And it was a little weird scrolling up and down the ceremony on this little tiny screen. But there you go.
And an experienced herald can just wing a ceremony too,
No,
if
it's,
need be.
yeah. Okay, so Crystal Leak asks about lecterns and music stands okay to use if you need to hold the ceremony book. We've had some talks about that kind of thing. I don't know that we've actually ever settled on anything. The heralds have been kind of debating about issues with maybe a herald who can't stand for an hour and a half that might be a good herald, and not being able to do a court because they can't stand for that long, and finding a stool that they could use and something that belonged to the heralds that could be used. We haven't quite gotten to the point of buying anything yet, because I think the decision making hasn't fallen all the way through, and I think we had to change in Vesper in there as well. So,
Right.
you know,
We have kept a stool or a seat by the thrones for when the herald needs to sit down.
Yeah.
The problem with using a lectern or a stand to hold music stand or something is that all too often you have to step forward when the royalty steps forward.
Yeah.
Because you are the voice of the royalty, you have to be with them. So if they step forward to do an award, you have to step forward with them because they have to read the book.
Yeah.
Or you have to be feeding them lines.
and you sometimes get royalty that can't stand still too. So you know.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
that can always be a lot of fun, you know, because they would sometimes the royalty will step further out, and so you have to kind of chase them with the ceremony book.
Yep.
You know. So yeah. I mean,
was it Havek and Alice's coronation?
Yeah.
We did that in the middle of court. It wasn't back under the royal. It wasn't up at the thrones. It was down in the middle of court.
Yeah.
So having a lectern would have been problematic.
Yeah. So yeah, it's a little difficult at times. I mean, there are situations where if we can, I mean, I can certainly see that you've got a herald who's really good, but maybe they broke their leg, right? They obviously can't stand. Well, having a stool of some sort would be useful, and you could still have that herald do that court. But that would mean the royalty couldn't move a whole lot. So yeah, there's some. It's an interesting point, and you know, and it's one, like I said, we have talked about it. I know we've had at some of our meetings we talked about it. We just never made a final decision. So sometimes you get enough people together, you're never going to get a final decision, I think.
Oh, one other tip that I had, if you are like some people, dyslexic.
Yeah.
Scientific studies have found that if they are reading it on colored paper or wearing colored lenses, the dyslexic person, or the person with dyslexia, finds it easier to read.
Sure.
Than if it's on white paper, black on white
There's
paper.
that one, and there are also a couple of fonts that they've come up with that can be used.
Yes, some fonts, that too.
So I can attest to the printing the ceremonies out on colored paper. I have a blue set and a pink paper set. Makes all the difference in the world.
Sure.
For me anyways.
Yeah.
And I think we did that for
You use the one
not Miles, his brother. The other one.
Luther.
No.
Elfar.
Elfar.
Thank you. Elfar. I was like, the face is right there, and I can't think of his name.
Sure.
Yeah, we did that for Elfar, and it helped. It made it. He didn't fumble his lines as much because he was able to read it.
Sure. We had a situation in Owertha at one point. I'd actually moved to the Bay Area, but I was up in Owertha at the time, where the incoming prince had a third grade education. Really nice guy. I mean, nobody had any problem with that. He's a really nice guy, but he couldn't read the ceremonies very well. And unfortunately, the herald didn't realize that they could prompt him and tell him what the lines were, right? And so he ended up not looking very good as prince for the first court. And then his princess, unfortunately, jumped all over the herald, which was not a great way to handle things. So yeah, sometimes the oddest things will come up. That's pretty rare for the most part within the SCA, but you do get people that don't read well. I mean, you know, they don't read out loud very well.
Or you get Uther for getting not realizing that he can't read without his glasses. That was in his last coronation. He turned to me and said, "Oh shoot, I don't have my glasses. I just realized I can't read it."
Yeah, and then there's the Herald's Terror, Jade. who was familiar enough with the ceremonies after 17 reigns that he would go way off script. And then he would come back on script. As long as he got all the important words said somewhere in there, the Herald just kind of had to keep track and go, okay, you skipped over this particular piece of information. It was a very tricky, and we've had a couple of Heralds just say, I'm never doing court again after trying to do court for Jade. Because he just, he's done it so many times that he knows the concepts, he knows what needs to be said for the most part, but he doesn't always do it in sequence. And it's a little frustrating for people. So yeah, so as a Herald, sometimes luckily that doesn't happen very often. So.
What were you gonna say?
Okay, anybody else? Well, I hope that helped with a lot of questions that people had. You can always contact myself, or you can always contact Demir, who is the Kingdom Court Herald, the Green Crown Herald, at greencrown@heralds.westkingdom.org, and the address will be in my notes, and it's also on the Herald's page, and all of that. So, so there's a lot of if you have questions, you can always contact people. You can contact your local herald, your principality heralds. Most of the principality heralds have got a real good feel for ceremony these days, and so on. So, but yeah, good luck with it. And like I said, if you have questions, let me know. So I'm going to turn off the recording.